you basically have a stress cup that you have to fill up throughout the day. And you don't want to fill it all the way up. You want to at least keep it 50% unfull because you want to have space if that you get like a major stressor, it doesn't overflow. But the pandemic was a major stressor. So fasting and ketosis are what are called mitochondrial stressors, which means they're good stress that makes you stronger. But if you have stress in the context of great stress, like a pandemic, these will make you weaker. So what I've learned is that these are great tools for optimizing health.
Awesome. I'm live with Dr. Molly Maloof, author of Spark Factor. You can pre-order it this month. And she does a lot of amazing things in the biohacking space. She's an entrepreneur, founder of Adamo Bioscience. She used to previously teach at Stanford. But I am going to let Molly introduce herself to talk about all the awesome stuff she's doing and why she wrote this book.
Oh, sure. Well, I wrote this book after practicing medicine for like the last 10 years and really wanting to give back to people because I'd learned so much about health and biohacking and health optimization and data driven, how to make data driven choices around your health. But I hadn't read a book that really had everything in it that I wanted to read that would have been a guidebook for me when I was younger. So the Spark Factor is really based on my philosophy of health, and it's really based on my practice of medicine and what I taught at Stanford around how do you extend health span. I've worked with so many companies in the last 10 years, so I've seen all sorts of amazing personalized health technologies, and I've always been an educator since medical school, so it was time for me to write a book to put all my thoughts on paper, and it was a really cool experience.
Amazing. Well, let's get into some of what you've written about. I think the book is focused on women in particular, because as women are practicing different measures of preventative care and wellness, there's different considerations. Can we dive into some of the things that you've learned and how you've written about it in your book?
Yeah. I mean, I wrote this book for women, but I definitely think men should read it if they date women because I think it's important that men understand women are different. And I don't think most men even understand a woman's cycle and how different it is to be in a woman's body than a man's body. Like I am a different woman for every part of my cycle, right? Like during your follicular phase, you're like outgoing and you're more energized and you definitely want to hit the gym and hit your personal best more easily. But then once you hit your ovulation and you really actually feel most attractive during ovulation. You feel most, turned on for a reason because you're supposed to try to be fine. Really, your body's trying to get you to have sex. Let's get real. Like the reality is that your biological imperative as a woman is to have children. Whether you have kids or not, your biology wants you to do it. So this is kind of like programming running in the background, whether we have kids or not. And I don't have children yet, but I definitely notice that midway through the month when I'm ovulating, I'm the most turned on. But then you get your luteal phase. And your luteal phase, you're like way more relaxed and way more, your energy levels just shift. You just start noticing that you don't have nearly as much a capacity to really hit it hard in the gym. You can still work out, but you don't get the same kind of results. And then once you start menstruating, typically during the first few days of menstruation and 2 days before, you might be a little irritable. Your cortisol's a little higher. You're definitely lower energy. And then by the end of your period, you start getting energized again. And oftentimes you do really well in fitness near the end of your period because your hormones are low. So, your hormones are fluctuating throughout the month. Initially, your estrogen's high during the follicular phase, but then your progesterone gets high during the luteal phase. So this changes your metabolism, changes your capacity to handle different stressors, changes your performance in the gym, and changes how you feel about your body. I mean, a lot of women get more bloated later on in their cycle. They get about 50% of women get PMS. Um, and we're now in a place where we can use our Aura Ring and we can use natural cycles and apps to monitor our fertility. Like fertility is like a big facet of being a woman that you have to think about if you are going to have kids. And so in the book, I talk a lot about how women need, when women can go out of their way to biohack their fertility. IVF is a way of biohacking fertility. Freezing your eggs is a form of biohacking. Men just need to go and, ejaculate into a cup and store it in a freezer. Women have to go through an entire process of hormones changing their bodies to enable a surgical removal of eggs. So it's a little bit different for women to do that. But there's a bunch of different things that women can do to optimize fertility that I write about in the book. And then I talk about how women have different life phases. So like when you're prepubescent, you're just a child. But once you hit puberty, your whole body starts to shift in ways that you didn't even understand. And then after that, I mean, men notice obviously puberty as well, but for women, we go through menopause, and men sort of go through andropause, but generally it's not nearly as dramatic as what women go through because we have these monthly cycles, and those end up starting to when you hit your late 40s, typically those start to change. And so women just have to think a little bit differently about their lifespan, about how to think about their hormones. And it can be a real challenge for a lot of people who are, female gender.
Yeah. How do you think about something like such as food? And how has your idea around personalized nutrition and diet evolved as you've kind of gone through your own health and wellness journey, as well as prepared to write this book or the advice that you give to other people in this book?
Well, the thing I've noticed is that, I mean, I'm actually someone who used to be insulin resistant, and I used fasting and I used ketosis to fix my insulin resistance. But the interesting thing I learned was that even though it worked for me to help my blood sugar levels, when I was combining these under high stress, it totally screwed up my health.
Hmm.
And I didn't really
And sorry,
realize
Molly,
that was
what
going to
is
happen.
insulin resistance? How would you define that?
Sure. So, insulin resistance can happen for a variety of reasons. So, if you overconsume food, I wasn't overweight, but I had gone off of stimulant medication. And what a lot of people don't know is that when you go off of stimulants, it can change your appetite. It can also change your dopamine levels in your brain. And I believe that it played a role in my insulin resistance is going off of stimulants because I gained weight and I also was eating too much sugar, and I was kind of coping with the lack of dopamine by over-consuming sugar. And so that really did lead to some blood sugar dysregulation for me. And insulin resistance can also be caused by inactivity, not exercising enough. It can be caused by having too much stress. It can be caused by abnormal circadian rhythms. It can be caused by exposure to too much pollution. So it can be caused by a lot of things, toxins in the environment as well. So there's a lot of causes, but for me, it was nutritional and it was changing medications. When people go on antipsychotic medications, which I've never taken, but I have friends who have bipolar, um, you can gain significant weight and it can actually cause insulin resistance on a cellular level. So, these medicines, they lower dopamine in the brain because typically when people have bipolar, they struggle with, too much dopamine. So basically, long story short, is insulin resistance is what happens when your cells get a little bit stuck, and the key to unlock the door to let glucose in, to let sugar in to be digested and turned into fuel, that door lock gets stuck. So insulin's this key that opens up the door to let the blood sugar into the cell. And if that key doesn't unlock properly, then blood sugar builds up outside the cell. And so my blood sugar levels were too high. And I
And
did
you measured
experiment with
that through,
ketosis,
sorry to double click
blood
again.
sugar monitoring,
Uh,
wearable
that
technology,
that's the main way
CGM.
that you have to
The
find that
I
out
mean, you can
is
get a
through that.
fasting blood sugar. You go to your doctor, you get a fasting blood sugar, you get a hemoglobin A1C. But for me, what really showed it was the continuous glucose monitor. And I was like running higher than normal blood sugar. And I was like, uh-oh, got a problem. And I initially tried to fast and I couldn't do it effectively. So I started doing a little bit of ketosis. And what I learned is that getting fat adapted is really important if you want to build metabolic flexibility, which is the ability to switch between metabolizing carbohydrates and metabolizing fats. And so I was metabolically inflexible, which means I was stuck in carb metabolism because I was eating a lot of extra carbs that I shouldn't be eating, a lot of sugar and refined carbohydrates. And as a result, I thought I was eating healthy food. I was eating like gluten-free foods, but it turns out that those refined carbohydrates were just getting vaporized into sugar. So my body was a little insulin resistant. And so I learned that if I flip the metabolic switch by doing some ketosis, that can actually help me learn to fast. So, when my body became more metabolically flexible and fat adapted, which is when you've built the machinery and you're able to metabolize your own fat more effectively, I was able to actually overcome my insulin resistance. But what I learned during the pandemic was that what was working for me before the pandemic wasn't working for me when I was under enormous stress. And I was like, well, why is it that I'm exercising and I'm eating really healthy and I'm doing keto, I'm in ketosis and or I'm trying to get into ketosis and I'm, doing intermittent fasting and things were not working for me. And I was like, it was the stress level that I was under that was basically making it so that you basically have a stress cup that you have to fill up throughout the day. And you don't want to fill it all the way up. You want to have you want to at least keep it 50% unfull because you want to have space if that you get more like a major stressor, it doesn't overflow. But the pandemic was a major stressor. So fasting and ketosis are what are called mitohormetic stressors, which means they're good stress that makes you stronger. But if you have stress in the context of great stress, like a pandemic, these will make you weaker. So, what I've learned is that these are great tools for optimizing health if you're under a little stress and you're in a generally normal baseline state and you've got insulin resistance, because they helped me, but they didn't work as well when I was stacking them during the pandemic. And the reason why is because I was overloading my stress cup. And so women don't always understand this, but we have a little bit of a different reaction to a lot of major stressors. Like we will we our hormones will get dysfunctional a little bit a little bit faster than men's if we overdo the stressors. And I think part of that reason is because of different biological imperatives. So we were designed to be in primitive, our genetics are designed for primitive life, but we live in modern life. But primitive times, we would be like, bearing children and taking care of the tribe. Men were going to go out and hunt and gather, and women were going to make sure that we, kept the tribe alive. And women did play a role in agriculture, of course. But men are kind of designed for aggression and defense. And men are more vasopressin dominant. This is just like a scientific fact. Like men have more vasopressin, women have more oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone of safety, trust, and love and nurturing, and men have oxytocin too. They just have less of it than women. So these different biological imperatives basically made me realize there's a reason why women have to be a little bit more careful with how we biohack, because we can do too much biohacking and break our hormones and end up actually not as strong as we'd want to be. And this is part of the reason why I wrote this book, because I was like, well, women need a guidebook, because I learned that a lot of stuff that was working for men in my practice wasn't working for women. And I had female clientele who were exercising like 7 days a week, and I was like, and they're coming to me with hormone dysfunction, weight loss resistance, and they're like, I can't lose any weight." And I'm like, "Well, your body's in a state of threat, and you're basically not only on top of that, you're having this psychosocial threat of feeling like you can't lose weight. So you've got all of the stress that's being poured into a system that's already being stressed through so much exercise, and you need to cut back on your exercise." And she did, and she started losing weight, which is fascinating. So we just need to really keep tabs on our stress levels and keep tabs on our bodies and our hormones so that we don't overdo these stressors that can make you stronger in the right doses.
You mentioned there's so many great jumping off points from there, but you
So many things to
mentioned
talk about.
this, yeah, so many things, so little time, but not really. We could jam for a little. Uh, the CGM is monitoring your glucose levels. You mentioned monitoring your stress levels. How would someone go about that? Is it just doing a cortisol test? I recently went to the doctor and I was like, "Can you measure my cortisol?" And they're like, "Sorry, it's not covered by insurance and it's going to be like super expensive." So, how would the normal layperson go about managing or evaluating their stress levels?
Sure. So there's this great checklist online called the stress warning signals. And actually, if you're listening to this podcast, and it's before January 31st, I will in my pre-order of my book, I've created an entire stress protocol and stress questionnaire. So if you pre-order the book and you enter your order code on my website, you'll get my best stress questionnaire, my best stress protocols, as well as access to a bunch of my favorite technologies with discounts. So the reason why I did this for the pre-sale is because I was like, people are very curious, like, where do I get these technologies? And so if you want to, it's not actually impossible to order. what's called a Dutch test online. If you go to precisionhormones.com, I believe you can actually get a Dutch test, and it's a cortisol test. And they do typically market through doctors, but I do believe that you can get one. I do believe you can actually order one of these through their website. So dutchtest.com is where I would go. But then also, there's a bunch of stress warning signals that you can pay attention to. And if you just Google stress warning signals, there's a bunch of different like things that you would want to pay attention to that are essentially like markers of like your stress levels are getting out of control. And so, if you're finding yourself really irritable with your family and your friends, if you're finding yourself extra, emotional and tearful, irritable, mood swings, extra sensitive to criticism. I mean, I was at this point, like there's a period of last year where I was definitely under way too much stress because it was, launching a book is surprisingly unhealthy. But then a lot of people also have like psychological symptoms of stress. So like trouble with concentration, trouble with indecision, memory lapses, feeling easily distracted, um, worrying a lot, having negative thinking. And then there's also behavioral changes like actually overworking yourself because it's almost like a defense mechanism. Neglecting your self-care, social withdrawal, insomnia. And then there's a lot of physical signals like aches and pains, muscle tension, grinding your teeth, frequent colds and infections. Um, some people end up with GI discomfort because they're not digesting properly. Weight loss or weight gain is typical. Indigestion, heartburn, hyperventilation, dizziness, palpitations.
So now, Molly, that you've learned that about like stress management or stress levels in general, you've learned that individually through your time, like going through COVID. And then you've also learned that through your clientele and your patients. How do you eat differently or how do you train differently when you're personally going through that? And how do you advise clientele do that?
I mean, one of the most important things that people need to know is that, and this is the biggest challenge. When you're under the most amount of stress is when you need the most amount of rest. And it's obvious that this makes sense, right? But people get really wired when they've got high cortisol states. And that wiredness will keep them up. And so I switch off of coffee and I start drinking mud water. Um, and I used to advise mud water, but I'm no longer working with them, but I'm still good friends with the company. And I love their products because they do have a fraction of the caffeine that coffee does. And don't get me wrong, I love coffee. It's one of the best performance enhancing tools out there. But if you're high cortisol, you don't want to be drinking a ton of coffee because you're just going to add more cortisol and you're going to burn yourself out faster. I typically switch from using, I don't do as many I mean, in the gym, like I still lift weights, but I'm not going to push myself as hard typically. I'm going to give myself a little bit of a break and I'm going to do more yoga and more restorative exercise. Sleep is like 100% a non negotiable. Making sure you get regular massages, making sure that you spend time with your family and your friends, making sure that you monitor I monitor my heart rate variability, and I try to do breath work and deep breathing. And I take supplements for stress like holy basil and rhodiola, ashwagandha. Um, I just started drinking ashwagandha turmeric latte by this turmeric drink by Mudwater, and it's crazy how much it relaxes you. I also like, holy basil by Organic India. So I drink a lot of tea and I just stay hydrated. And honestly, the best thing I did for myself was I took a vacation. And it was the end of, last
Getting
year.
off your phone, right?
I took about, yeah, I was like surrounded by nature in a rainforest. And I mean, I swear to God, nature is the most healing form of stress relief that exists. So if you can get into nature, there's evidence that nature exposure, especially like, pine forests are particularly effective at reducing stress. And they think it's because of there's all these like, essential oils that come off of pine that literally are in the air that clean the air and that also produce, beneficial effects on the immune system. And this is actually research out of Japan on forest bathing. But I have to say, forest bathing, like, if it makes me want to live by a forest really badly, honestly, because I really do believe that nature is everything. It really is something else.
You know, there's so much to learn from just being in nature, what it does to your body and your mind. Speaking
Yeah,
of
it's just healing.
pine trees, have you ever experimented with pine pollen? Pine pollen?
I have. I
It's
have.
very strong.
It's a strong supplement. It's a Chinese, technically considered like in Chinese herbalism to be a tool for improving it's an adaptogen, but it also improves testosterone levels. They say it's like a plant, it's kind of like plant semen, if you think about it that way. But yeah, pine pollen's great. But if you think about it, that's kind of what it is. But it's cool. Like I definitely have experimented with it at one point. You got to be careful with sourcing, make sure you get the right sourcing of it, but it's pretty potent stuff.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard you talk about as you've gone through your time in COVID is just the power of social connection and how you've realized. I think if I'm putting it into summary, is like you've realized that you could be doing all the biohacks in the world, eating healthy, exercising, meditating, but if you don't have that, you really don't have much, and it can all kind of go to waste. How have you thought about that, and how have you incorporated more of that into your life?
Yeah, I mean, I moved to Austin for a reason because the community there is just amazing. And I was just like, wow, like I totally need to be around friends because I was isolated during part of the pandemic, as a lot of us were. And if you put an animal in isolation as a research experiment, they will end up with anxiety, depression, or like stress related disease. And so it's like we just did that human experiment and it pretty much showed us the same thing. And there's a lot of people, I mean, there was a lot of social injury during the pandemic. There's a lot of people who got, I mean, there was like all sorts of reports of domestic abuse and child abuse. Like it was really bad for humanity to be isolated that long. So I went out of my way during the pandemic to spend a lot of time with family and friends. Um, 2021, I got vaccinated and I started traveling. And oh my God, I was high on life when I was seeing all my friends in different cities. I was like having the best time. And I remember just being like, feeling slightly manic in my happiness of seeing my friends in LA. Like, I went from being, like, isolated in Florida to, like, surrounded by friends again, and it was just the most magical experience. And it's part of what actually instigated me starting this company. It was, like, a couple of things. First was I really felt like we everyone says love heals, but love is actually a really complicated thing, and I was like, everybody knows we all love love, but we all know that love comes with complexity. And I really wanted to figure it out. I was like, I really feel like love is super powerful, but I kind of went into this business during the pandemic with a very idealistic attitude about love. I was like, oh, love is just like this beautiful emotion that we feel and such a powerful part of being human. And, you know, and then I started studying the science of it, and I started, because I was commercializing a love drug, and I was, like, very much like, "This is gonna save, marriages, it's gonna help heal sexual dysfunction." Because I actually accidentally healed my own sexual dysfunction with MDMA in my late 20s before I became a doctor, and I didn't know that I didn't know I had sexual dysfunction until it was gone, but, the thing is that the sexual dysfunction was fixed, but the relationship problems that I had and the attachment issues that I was dealing with were not fixed. And so I had worked on a lot of different aspects of understanding love during the founding of this company because I was like, I think that I have a hypothesis that people like love, and I believe that love heals, but then I also and I had there was this love drug that was like this powerful tool. But then as I started building the company and I patented this formula and I started studying the science of love, I started realizing I was opening a Pandora's box and that love was not always like this Disney movie, beautiful story of happy endings. Love comes with all sorts of negative things, right? Because of loss of love. So when people get divorced, they can destroy each other's lives. When people lose a family member, it can seriously disrupt their mental health. When people don't love themselves and struggle with loving their own existence, they can commit suicide. And I was like, wow, like lack of love is clearly a problem. But what about when there's unhealthy love? When people fall in love with someone that doesn't love them back and and they start stalking? What about the fact that there's an entire industry around spyware of men and women stalking their partners using software? What about like I mean, there's so many facets of unhealthy love. And that's when I realized that like I had a lot of work to do before I was ready to launch this company. So I actually like paused the drug development and I went back to the drawing board and I was like, okay, like what do I think is not going to harm people? What do I think is actually going to help people? Because I was starting to really be, as much as I'm very, very, very much like, I believe that psychedelics have capacity to heal. And I think that they're going to play a big role in mental health in the future. I realize that they're also very dangerous if used inappropriately and used in the wrong setting with the wrong, preparate like improper preparation. They're like, surgical tools. Like if you know what you're doing with a surgical tool and you're trained, it can transform you can get brain surgery and be cured from a disease. But if you don't know what you're doing, you could cut someone open and hurt them.
Yeah.
And so
Or
I
get
went from
addicted to
being
plastic
really
surgery.
idealistic. Oh, yeah, exactly. And I went from being really idealistic and really believing in the power of love to being like, "Oh, love is powerful for sure, but if used improperly, it can actually hurt people." And so I've been really learning that like we don't get taught about love in school. We don't get taught about sex education in school. We don't get taught about attachment in school. We don't get taught about social connection in school. So all of these things are things that I've done research on, and we're finishing a rebrand and we're going to start basically building out media products, as well as we're going to be building out a new sex therapy, and then eventually building out products for social connection later on. So we're building an entire platform approach to love and connection, but I had to actually take a step back from everything and pause because I was like, "Oh my god, I can't commercialize this drug because it's probably gonna hurt people." So
What was the
I'm not gonna
drug?
say that it's gonna hurt people, but it was a combination drug of analog research chemicals that a friend of mine had developed underground. And it's not that it's a bad drug, and it's not that it's, like, dangerous per se, but it's one of those things where we need to learn how to produce love within our bodies without having to take drugs. And we need and obviously, I do think that there's a role for MDMA in healing. Like, I was very much dramatically improved my life through psychedelics, but I did a lot of research before I even went near them, and I was very careful with them, and most people aren't very careful with these things. And so I'm just like doing the hard work now of figuring out how do you build research protocols for sexual dysfunction that are drug agnostic that could be used with as like an integration program for example, MDMA assisted therapy. But let's not put the cart before the horse and let's actually do our homework on like what is best for humanity and how do we build products and services that create more love and help people understand the pros and cons of love and the risks of loss of love so that we can create pathways for healing when we know that like half the DSM is due to abuse and neglect and humans mistreating humans and being unkind to one another.
Double clicking for a moment into your own path and how what even got you here. When you mentioned sexual dysfunction and then having this experience and healing or getting through that, what did that, and now as you're diving into education or in that space, what did that look like? What can people look out for? And then what did it look like on the other side of it?
Well, so I'm one of like there's 20% of women in college experience date rape, or at least or if it's not date rape, it's 20% of college age women are raped in college, and it's like a pretty serious problem. And one in five women are let's see, 1 in 4 women are abused as sexually abused as children, 1 in 3 are assaulted, 1 in 5 are raped, and so there's, like, a lot of sexual assault in the world, and the numbers on men are significant, but and probably underreported, but they're out there, and the CDC has this data, and so I was one of those women who was date raped in college twice, and looking back on it, it's funny because you've really done a lot of work on yourself and your trauma when you're no longer really reacting to it. You're like, oh, it's just an old story that happened to me. It's just a boring story. But when I was in my 20s, I didn't know that that had affected my nervous system. And I didn't know that it had made me more hypervigilant and more sympathetic dominant and more defensive and aggressive in a lot of ways. And actually during sexual experiences, I was unable to have an orgasm because I was in pain because I wasn't aroused and my body wouldn't let me let go. And that was really challenging, is like being like, shit, I can't have good sex. And I didn't even know what good sex was because I was just like, every time I had sex, it was just like performative act. And as I've learned from starting this company, I've met so many women who've told me similar stories about their own journey of sexual trauma. And I'm like, oh my God, like one of the things I want to do with this company is build a community of women because there's so little education out there for us, and you really have to seek it out, and it can be really triggering for women to read stuff about sexual trauma, and so, like, you have to be really delicate with how you approach it, and I think I buried it for years. I just didn't wanna pay attention to it, and it came out through experiences with partners, and this experience that I had with this one partner with MDMA where I was, like, able to talk about my experiences without feeling any shame. But the other part of it was my body was no longer in a state of fear. And by the way, this is not the massive disclaimer. This is not a recommendation from a doctor to go take MDMA and do what I did. That's absolutely not recommended. There are serious risks of taking psychedelics and uncovering sexual trauma. First, foremost being you kind of have to look at trauma like a dragon that's like been in hiding. And if you wake up a dragon, it can attack you. So what a lot of people don't realize is that when you meet people who have traumatic experiences and they have overreactivity or they get triggered and they get really angry about something, it's often it's their brain still has memories of traumatic experiences that have not been properly stored, like properly moved from implicit memory, which is present moment experiences, to explicit memory, which is like past memory. Like this is the past. This happened in the past. This was the past. So if you are a person who has trauma and you get triggered by something, what happens is your brain starts interpreting that experience as that reminds me of that thing that happened to me, and oh my God, I'm unsafe, I'm in danger, and you overreact or you attack. And some people turn off and they shut down and they will do what's called fawn. Well, they'll just be really agreeable and they'll like overlook their own needs, or they'll just like shut down completely and just like turn off. So the nervous system in a state of threat, according to polyvagal theory, is going to fight or flight, which means run away or attack, freeze, or fawn. And if you don't have trauma, typically your nervous system just responds like in a normal manner, and you just listen and you attune to you attune to the person you're talking to, and you like, have a conversation. So what I'm trying to explain is that if you go out and just experiment with psychedelics and you uncover you have trauma, you may end up destabilized, and you actually may not be prepared for that destabilization. So in my experience, like the sexual dysfunction went away, but the trauma was still, I still had to deal with the psychological effects of the trauma, but the physiological effects had shifted, but I still had a lot of work to do on myself. And like that work involved various forms of somatic therapy. It involved narrative therapy, which is like writing out my story to myself and talking about it with a therapist. And it involved like really working on attachment. And like I had a little bit of attachment issues with my parents for a variety of reasons. And so like there was a lot, I still had a lot of psychological work to do, but what was really interesting was like the physiological stuff was gone. So that's kind of what I want to explain to people out there if they're listening, if they have a history of sexual trauma and they have sexual dysfunction. You shouldn't just go out and like think that, taking medicine with a partner is going to just like fix your trauma. Because what it can do is it can uncover the fact that there's like a lot of other things that go along with trauma, which is, you have to learn to love. I mean, you have to learn to love yourself. You have to learn to lift the shame you have around it. You have to learn to have courage to talk about it. You have to be able to like tell people that you love that this thing happened to you without feeling scared. I mean, there's a lot of fear that can come up for women and men who have trauma. So this is why I'm very excited about psychedelic assisted therapy, which basically implies that you're not just taking medicine, but you're also doing the work to consolidate that memory from this is traumatic and painful to this was a past experience that happened to me and I'm okay. And so my journey took some time. It was not like it was like the sexual dysfunction was fixed, which was awesome. So my 30s were just frankly great. I was very, very fortunate. But like but what we need to teach people is that healing is more than that. And really, if you really want to address sexual dysfunction, you do need to look at the psychology as well as your physiology in order to actually experience your full amount of pleasure and also full amount of love.
So fast forward to today, I know you've kind of gotten off of like trying to treat this with a drug, and you mentioned like a new, more modern form of sexual therapy. Without giving all the details because it's still in development, do you have any sort of like core tenets that you'd be open to sharing around how that programming would look like?
Sure. Yeah. So the interesting thing we built this therapy around is so I've co-created this therapy with two world-class sex therapists, Saida Desilets and Aaron Michaels. And these two are just rock stars. And I'm like very much committed to like letting the world know that they were I mean, it was their work plus my work together that's created this therapy. It was definitely a work and I put together the team to make this thing happen. And I've also gotten help from other therapists like pelvic floor therapists, and I have other psychologists that I'm working with because we're designing a drug agnostic therapy, but that is a drug assisted therapy if people want to use it with medicine. So there's a variety of medicines that already exist for sexual dysfunction, but there is no drug assisted therapy that exists today for sexual dysfunction. There's basically drugs for sexual dysfunction, and then there's sexual dysfunction therapies, but there's nothing that's combined the two. So I was like, well, I'm going to design. Initially, it started out as a psychedelic assisted sex therapy, but then I realized, well, not everybody's going to want to take psychedelics. So what do I do? How do I teach people how to have better sex? So I started researching sex therapy. I was like, what does sex therapy look like? And I discovered that almost all sex therapy today is based on psychological therapy. So it's like getting through the psychological barriers to sex because realistically, sex does begin in the mind. Like you you get aroused first in your head as a woman. Men maybe men would argue that they don't maybe they feel more it's in their body than their mind, but for women at least it feels like arousal starts in the mind. And so what we're doing with this therapy is we're starting it out as like we're kind of designing it like you would a psychedelic therapy, where in psychedelic therapy you have a preparation, and that means you screen for conditions, you look for contraindications, like who would not be a candidate for this therapy. You look for interactions, like okay, if you are going to combine this therapy with medicine, what should you like? What of the medicines that we offer? Who should take which ones and who should not? And what are interactions that you would have if you took these medicines? And then like who's not a candidate for the therapy alone? So really trying to like properly give this and prescribe this therapy to people. And then, like thinking about what are some ways that you can prepare for having a sexual experience, right? And part of it is, like identifying, what are your biggest barriers to pleasure? What are your biggest what are the things that turn you on? So like really digging into like a person's sort of like sexual health profile we're building. And then we have a specific protocol for the act of having sex. So right now, when people get educated around sexuality, they go to pornography or they go to different platforms that teach people about having sex. And what we're designing is very much like we're creating a bespoke protocol that's for our company that's like because like modern sex therapy today as it exists for medicine um is mostly sensate therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness based therapies. So all of these therapies are based off of not actually having sex, but talking about sex, talking about, thinking about sex, about and thinking about, the psychological barriers to sex. And then sensei therapy is this therapy designed by Masters and Johnson back in I don't know, the 60s. So it's all about doing everything but sex. It's like, don't have sex with your partner for like a month. And that does help people because it keeps them from repeating the things that aren't working. But what we're literally designing is like, this is how you have sex. This is how you understand before you have sex if your partner is um physically like sending you the signals that they want this. So one of the biggest problems in sex education today is that there's a lot of a sexual assault happening because men and women are not sending verbal signals to each other before they have sex. They're not actually talking necessarily. And so there's this whole gray area between emotional intimacy and physical intimacy. And what we're doing is creating language in that space so that people learn that, like, this is what body language looks like if a person wants to have sex. And you would think it's intuitive, but actually there's a lot that's missed. And I think that's a big reason why there's a lot of sexual trauma in the world is because there's just like people aren't educated about this. And then there's the actual act of having sex. And so it's literally about creating physical, emotional, and basically physical, emotional, and like and spiritual connection between two people. And so it's about teaching people how to move their bodies in ways that enhance pleasure for both partners and reduce a lot of pain. So like right now when a lot of people have sex, they're not properly aroused and they have a lot of pain. And I get this from men and women in my practice, by the way. So like men come to me in my practice and they're like, hey, every time I have sex, I have like these like micro tears on my penis and have the exact same thing told by me by women. And it's because most sex today is based on friction, but the sex that we're teaching is based on suction. So it's a new way of it's I mean, people if you learn how to do it,
Suction, based on
you may notice
suction.
that you've already
What's
yeah. So
what does that mean?
a lot of people I mean, I want to tell everything to you, but basically I want people to come out and I want them to
And
see the
read the
product we're
yeah.
building. But
Yeah, of
it's
course.
we're gonna be like we're gonna be taping videos. It's not gonna be pornography. It's gonna be very educational. But we're literally building like like sex ed for modernity because I think there's a lot of problems in human
It's
sexuality that need to be
fascinating.
fixed. And so, I've been practicing some of these things that I'm learning. Specifically around like sexual engorgement of the sex organs. Like men and women both have erectile tissue, and yet women are not taught that we need to become erect because we don't have physical penises like men do, but we have tissue that's analogous to the penis inside the body. And so what women don't learn is that when you're really ready to have sex, you have physical signs that your body is ready to have sex. But oftentimes those signs are ignored because men and women aren't aware of what those signs are. So we're actually on top of the actual sex therapy, which is like the act of having sex, there's an integration program. And integration program is based on the top sexual dysfunctions that people experience. So there's integration for um, lack of desire. There's integration for lack of arousal. There's integration for erectile dysfunction, integration for premature ejaculation, integration for sexual pain, and integration for anorgasmia. And so we're building these tools because not everybody's going to integrate because not everybody has like the same sexual dysfunction. So we're building our integration program around, we're going to screen people for the problems. And then we're going to give them the integration tools to help with like training their bodies to overcome the problems that they have. And I do think that, you know, tadalafil, PT-141, certain types of cannabis, psilocybin, what was that? So PT-141 and tadalafil are prescription medications for sexual dysfunction in men and women. So what's really cool is that they actually are drugs approved. So we're going to launch with compounding versions of these medicines. And then we're also going to be developing other medicines with other companies. And so basically building out an entire suite of interventions for people.
It's so fascinating how you went from like the food, nutrition, exercise, maybe the things that people think about every day when they think about wellness, to really wanting to dedicate a lot of your time and energy to sexual wellness.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, I kind of feel like, frankly, we've figured out how to eat. Like, how to eat is not rocket science anymore. It's whole foods, figure out what your macros are, figure out whether you are plant-based or more carnivore or paleo or in the middle Mediterranean zone. It's really like about experimenting with these different dietary styles, but eating whole foods and eliminating processed foods. If you do those things, you are going to have a really healthy body. Problem I learned is that I was like, why is it that there are people in my practice that I can tell them exactly how to eat and they still reach for the cookie and they still eat the things that are not good for their body? And I started to realize that there's something else going on with obesity, and it wasn't related to just the food. It was related to the trauma that's underneath the surface of a lot of people who have obesity and overweight. And I look at obesity and overweight and binge eating and anorexia and bulimia, and it's two sides of the same disordered nervous system coin. So in a disordered nervous system, it's either going to become hyperactive or hypoactive. And if you have trauma, social injury, not everybody has PTSD, but if you talk to people who are morbidly obese, you talk to people with eating disorders, they have issues with their parents, they have attachment issues, they have abuse, sometimes they have neglect, sometimes they were born into poverty, but they have pain, and it's pain under the surface that has not been properly. It's like if food was literally the solution, then people would just eat what was healthy. Like if we knew that, like, I think we know how to eat healthy at this point. I think the problem is that there's a lot of people who are like, I know I'm supposed to eat better. I know I'm supposed to eat more if you're anorexic. I can't do it. And it's because their brain has been wired differently. And that's usually because there's unresolved pain, unresolved attachment issues, unresolved ACEs. And these are under the surface in the subconscious running the show. And this is part of the reason why I have a company around the science of love. Because, of course, yes, we are building a sexual dysfunction protocol and a product, but
It's really
I
about mental
believe
health.
that it's really about mental health, and it's about really realizing that mental and physical health are connected, and you can't like most mental illnesses are actually rooted in mitochondrial dysfunction, and people don't even know that. But a lot of mitochondrial dysfunction is due to social injury and stress and and like literally experiences in life that cause the body to go into a state of disorder. So I feel like I really understand health differently now than I did before, cuz like I now have like no issues with food at all. Like food is just like this. I'm like free. Like I literally have like food freedom, and it was like during the pandemic that I got there, and it was through working on my relationship to my parents and my relationship to myself. And I was like, well, shit, how come I spent all this time studying food? And of course, I do think that like, food, I do think that for some people just don't know how to choose food properly. But it's really surprising to me that like, I think we're overlooking the dietary mental health interactions. And we're like, we just think that people are obese because people are just obese because they make bad decisions. They're lazy. And it's like, I have met so many obese people. They are not lazy. They are trying their hardest. They have tried every diet in the book. They have really, really tried. Most people I know who are obese are really struggling. And it's like they definitely don't want to be obese. I promise you that. And so that's one of the things that's really shifted my mindset is like, yes, of course, putting a blood sugar monitor on is going to help me maintain my body. But it's like, yes, it can help you lose weight. But if you don't really deal with the reasons why you're reaching for the cookies, you're gonna return to them when you take the blood sugar monitor off. And that's what I saw clinically happening, was like people knew how to be healthy, but they kept on making the wrong decisions. And it was inevitably the clients of mine that struggled with social connection. They struggled with adverse childhood experiences. They struggled with disorganized attachment patterns. They struggled with a parent with a personality disorder. And that had imprinted on their subconscious different wiring. And I was like, man, I feel like if we understood this better, the world would look very different in terms of health. And so that's part of the reason why I'm like so excited about this company I'm building, because I think we can actually help a lot of different conditions. But we got to start with one. And I think sex is fun.
It is. Where have we not covered in terms of the scope of how you think about well-being? Is there anything that you want to make sure that we get to that we haven't yet?
I mean, I want to bring the conversation back to food a little bit because I want to really explain to people what mitochondria are.
Please,
Because a
yeah.
big part of this book is mitochondrial health. And like nobody understands these things. And I'm like, I spent so much time learning about them that I'm like, these things are awesome. So
I,
there's
Molly,
organelles in your cell.
quick question, that just curiosity question. Sorry to like take us off the rails again, but as you were talking about emotional and mental health, we have these things that are measuring heart rate variability, which can kind of tell us whether we're in fight or flight. We have these continuous glucose monitors that can help us monitor our glucose, sleep, etc. And some of the stuff that you mentioned is related to like dopamine and serotonin. And as you've been on sort of the cutting edge of biohacking, are there ways, or do you think there's going to be ways where we can measure our dopamine and serotonin levels? So folks that maybe are not as socially aware or self-aware can basically objectively measure, besides the stress stuff and the heart rate variability, hey, this is where my dopamine or my serotonin is at. And now I need to go through these sort of modalities to heal it.
I was just having this conversation with this guy from Self Hacked. And he was really arguing with me. I love Joe. We're friends, but we were having an argument around urine organic acids and their utility in measuring different markers of health. But there's a marker called homovanillic acid, and it's a byproduct of dopamine metabolism. And at the end of last year, let me just like pull mine up and see if I can find mine. Pretty sure mine was low because like I overdid last year. I did too many things. I fundraised. I moved. I finished a book, edited a book, recorded a book, marketed a book, advised a bunch of companies, and I also saw some patients. And so it was a bit of a unhealthy level of stress last year, which I would not recommend. And this year's I'm definitely like I am trying to slow down a bit and get more balanced because I'm aware of my limitations at this point. But there's a byproduct of um I can actually pull it up right now. It's kind of cool. But I guess I can't share my screen, but long story short, yeah, I can share my screen. So if you see this, you can see this thing here. This is homovanillate vanillamyl. These are also known as homovanillic acid and vanilla. I can't pronounce it very easily, but these are literally metabolites of dopamine and norepinephrine. Yeah, and so I'm on the low end of normal. Look at that. I'm like at 3 and 2.2. So I am at the low end of the range on both of those, right? So basically, what happens is it's the end of the year, and I'm like, I have broken my brain. What am I gonna do? And I'm just like, I am feeling very irritable. I'm feeling very much like very stressed out. And I don't want to show you my cortisol levels, but they were ridiculous, like off the charts cortisol. So, I'm thinking to myself, uh-oh, I fucked up. I definitely did. I got to take my own medicine. So I stopped drinking coffee and I stopped going hard in the gym and I start sleeping more and I start spending more time with my friends. I start doing more recovery practices, start doing sauna, less cold plunge, more yoga, and slowly my cortisol starts to normalize. But I still felt like, and I didn't burn out, by the way. Let's get that clear. I did not burn out. I'm proud of that. But so I course corrected. But then I still felt like my nervous system was like, it was off. I was like, something's still off. Still feel like I've got low dopamine, low norepinephrine. So I was like, universe, like, please help me. I need some help right now. Like, I've got to finish this book and I've got to get this thing launched. And I like definitely need to course correct. So I go to a party it's like like a big health like conference. And I didn't want to go, but my friend Anthony was like, Molly, you're coming. You said you were coming. You're coming. And I was like, fine, I'll come. I was so tired. And I go to this party and I meet this woman, Lana Morrow. And Lana is like, hey, I'm this researcher and I'm a doctor and I just got published in Nature. And here's my paper on like how our brain frequency technology cures ADHD. And I was like, what? I have ADHD. I need help. Please sign me up. When can I see you? And I was like, look, I will, if you can help me, I will blow up your company. I will literally take your company and I will take it to everyone I know. Like if this works, I promise you I need help. And so I go to her house 2 weeks later and I sit down and I put this headset on my head and she's like, okay, use your brain to control the screen. And I was like, what? And it was really hard initially. I was like, okay, I'm trying. I'm trying. I'm like playing a video game with my brain. And I'm like trying, and I'm not getting very good scores. And it's day one. And then, and then I was like, okay, next. And so the first part of the video game is like, you're like using your frontal lobe and you're like trying to get this little thing to keep on playing like up and down. It's like, it's this weird game. Second part of the game is like, you have to basically, you're like focusing on your cerebellum and you're trying to get these markers to move apart. And I was like, all right, I know how my cerebellum works. I bet if I think about doing yoga, I could get my cerebellum to like do this. And so I literally was able to like figure out how to use my cerebellum. And it was like squeezing, it was like literally exercising my brain. And every single day I got better and better scores on this video game. And every single day, my brain, my mood started to change. My face started to change. I started to look younger and my focus started to improve. And literally by 4 days of this, I was like, oh my God, Lana, what have you done to me? Like, I feel like my brain is different. Like, this is crazy. And then the results have lasted. So, like, I've done all sorts of neurofeedback. I've done probably 50 hours of neurofeedback in the last 2 years. And I'm not even kidding. This thing blew it out of the water. But I was like, how does this thing work? And she's like, it increases dopamine and norepinephrine. And I was like, well, holy shit, lady. We need to run a study where we measure these metabolites and then measure before and after. So I'm actually gonna run another Dutch test and see the effects of this on my brain. Cause like, I'm not kidding. I was like, this is like the future, by the way. And I remember like, I'm like, I get to try
What is
everything
it
before
called?
everyone else does. It's called Think Interfaces.
Yeah, I remember you were
It's
using
really,
CGMs back when I met you like 6 years ago, before anyone else
yeah.
was using them.
And now those are all over the world. Yep.
Yeah, very interesting. And what is
You're all set.
neuroepinephrine?
Norepinephrine?
Yeah, can you give us?
Norepinephrine is a stress hormone, but it's also important for focus and attention. So it's like the reason why we have stress hormones is so we pay attention to things that could hurt us, and so we run away, right? Or we like focus on the things that could be like dangerous, so we make sure we're alert. So we need stress hormones in order to function properly. And the downside of chronic stress is that can deeply affect your brain's functioning over time. And this is why a lot of people take stimulants, by the way, because stimulants increase norepinephrine and dopamine. Oftentimes they block reuptake.
Isn't that what cold plunges do too? They boost neuroepinephrine.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, so
exactly.
mitochondria. Speaking of, let's spend a little bit of time
Yeah,
on that. I thought about this dopamine serotonin measuring because I had recently met someone who was working on technology to measure your mitochondrial function.
yeah. So, um, mitochondria. I have a friend who does have a company called Mycon Health. In fact, I should reconnect with him. Um, he's in LA, and I actually really miss my friends. But long story short,
Israeli?
mitochondria are basically the batteries. He's in LA. Yeah,
Yeah, I know him.
I'm gonna, yeah, I'm gonna invite him to my event on Thursday. But yeah, so basically, mitochondria are power plants. So they take it, we breathe in air and we get oxygen. We eat food, we get carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Those get broken down by our digestive system. and they get converted into substrates. Substrates are things like acetyl-CoA. Anyway, these substrates go into the cell, and they go into the mitochondria, and they get turned into energy. So they have to get into the mitochondria to do so. And when they get inside there, they get, basically, we basically pull off electrons, and that powers this thing called the electron transport chain. And then that powers a hydrogen turbine, and that creates an electrochemical gradient, and that creates a battery. And so you've got batteries in your cells, and then you also have capacitors. So the differential charge between two membranes creates polarity. So one of the things that people should know about life is that polarity is life. Without polarity, you're dead. So you need electricity in your cells, and you need, basically your cells basically communicate through electricity and chemical messengers. So long story short, mitochondria are not just producing energy, bioenergetics is what it's called, but they're also directing where the energy goes. And then they're also playing a role in signaling, cell signaling. So they also play a role in the production of neurotransmitters, in the production of dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, in the production of sex hormones. And so they literally are modulating the sensor that we're getting all these signals from the outside world, and the mitochondria are like taking in all this information, and they're like, okay, what do I do? This energy, where's it going to go? And it's like, well, am I alive? Am I safe? Okay, cool. Safe. I'm alive. Got enough food. I'm going to go find a partner and make another person. That's your biological imperative, whether you have kids or not. Your body's like, I'm going to try to make you make more people. Because it's so funny because so many people get pregnant or like have kids and they're like, well, it was an accident. Well, like, it wasn't an accident. Your body knew exactly what it was doing. Your brain maybe didn't know, but your body knew. It knew it wanted to make another you. And it's the beauty of biology. I love biology for this reason, because it's like once you really understand how biology works and like the actual programming under the surface, you're like, well, shit. If I had learned this before I became a doctor, I probably wouldn't have become a doctor. I would have just like taught the world organismal biology. But I'm grateful for my education. It taught me a lot. But long story short, mitochondria are like sensing and integrating the environment, and they're also literally deciding where the energy goes. So they're trying to figure out, do we need to reproduce? Do we need to defend ourselves against infection? Do we need to mount an inflammatory response? So they play a big role in the immune response, which is why if you have low energy capacity and you are like under serious chronic stress over long periods of time, you're going to get infections more often because you're going to have less energy to mount an immune response, and your alarm systems are going to break, because it's kind of like a house that has like energy cut. You're just going to break the alarm system. The alarm system's not going to turn off if there's no energy running through. So you got to look at the body like you got to protect your body like a house. You got to make sure you have enough energy, you got enough resources, that you're safe, and you got to protect yourself from invaders like viruses. And so when I was studying COVID, I was studying like not I was studying COVID, I was studying viruses the summer before the pandemic. And I was like, I don't think people realize this, but chronic fatigue is due to intracellular infections. And all these doctors think that chronic fatigue is due to like psychosomatic illness. It's like, no, 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 no. People broke their metabolism because they were running on low energy, and they got an infection. They got inside the cell and hijacked their metabolism for its own purposes. And it evades the immune response and drains energy. It's like when I figured that out, I was like, oh my God, we're so overdue for a plague, and we're not even prepared for it. What are we gonna do? And I was talking to my friends about this. I was like, well, shit, we're totally overdue. So anyway, long story short, I became a mitochondriac when one of my friends was like, went from being like this overweight investment banker to being like the fittest big wave surfer you've ever seen. And I was like, how did you do it? And he's like, I hacked my mitochondria. And I was like, what? So that's the secret. And so really taking care of your mitochondria is really the way to build a strong and healthy body. But one of the biggest things that we do wrong is we put the wrong fuel in the gas tank. So if you fuel the body improperly, you will break the mitochondria. Just like if you took diesel fuel and you put it in a gasoline, in a gas engine, you're not supposed to do that, right? Well, you're not supposed to put fake food into a body that wants whole food. And so we got to be really careful with the processed foods you eat. because they might be okay in the short term, but over long periods of time, fast food, high fat, high carb, processed foods, they're gonna wear you down, and they're gonna
How about these
break your
like
engines. They're gonna make you
how
sick.
about these like keto processed foods? Like whether it's like a bar,
Yeah.
like a Catalina Crunch cereal, things like that. Like I kind of
So I
justify
used to
eating them in
love
my
Catalina
head.
Crunch.
Like I justify eating them in my head because I'm like, it's
I
not as
used to
bad.
love it.
Okay. And then what
I
happened?
used to love Catalina. I used to love it, by the way. I really did. And during the pandemic, I'm gonna be honest with you. I I was like, it's a pandemic. I'm gonna eat whatever I want. I gained 10 pounds. I I didn't follow my own diet, and I ate a lot of companies were sending me processed foods, and I was like having fun. I was like, I'm gonna eat all these things people are sending me. I like Magic Spoon and Catalina Crunch and all these other products. And I learned that there's no free lunch when it comes to biology, man. Like I'm not gonna say don't eat Catalina Crunch, but all I know is that I ate it consistently and it gave me gut dysfunction because and not everybody. I mean, I do okay with pea protein, but it also has canola oil in it. So it's like, is it a lesser evil? Of course, it's not probably as bad as like eating Trix or Captain Crunch, but it's definitely a processed food. So it should not be an everyday thing. It is what it is, you know? Like I do have like, you know, this creamer from Mudwater I brought with me because they sent it to me, and it's like a coconut MCT creamer. That's a processed food. Do I eat that all the am I consuming this thing like all the time every day? No. There's certain processed foods that are better than others, but generally speaking, like you do need to look on the back and you got to listen to your body. And my body was telling me these things are not working for me, so I had to stop.
Molly, you're a wealth of information. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. I like learning about the things that are cool. I love food, sex, technology, wellness. If you like those things, follow me on Instagram because I have a lot of content. I also do a lot of health news. So I'm like constantly giving people new updates on health.
Yeah, I wanted to just end with that. Where can people learn more about you? Your Instagram is Dr. Maloof,
drmolly.co.
drmolly.co. Okay. And anywhere, anything else you want to plug in before we sign off for today?
Well, I just want to say I'm like super excited about your company and I'm so proud of you and I'm like so stoked for what you've built. It's just amazing watching you grow into the man you are today and like so excited for what you're building.
Thank you. Thank you. Excited to hopefully see you in person soon. Maybe next week.
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
I would love that. Let's do it.
And again, Spark Factor, Dr. Molly Maloof. It's out on 1/31, January 31st. There's 31 days in January, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. And
That's true. That's true.
thanks
Yeah,
again.
you can find me at drmolly.co, the website, by the way.
Perfect.
So drmolly.co is both my website and my Instagram. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, Molly.
Thank you, John.